Coming up on this episode, we're going to talk about some of the misconceptions regarding divorce and annulments as we speak with Father Luke Millette from the Archdiocesan Metropolitan Tribunal. Welcome to Around the Archdiocese.
Sharing information, insights, and stories about our Catholic faith from across the Archdiocese of Galveston-Houston, you're listening to Around the Archdiocese. Here's your host, Sean O'Driscoll.
Hello and welcome to Around the Archdiocese. Thank you for joining us again. My name is Sean O'Driscoll, and I am blessed to serve as the Senior Communications Manager here for the Archdiocese of Galveston-Houston. And today with me, I have Father Luke Millette.
Hi there.
And Father Luke serves as the Judicial Vicar for the Archdiocese, working in the Metropolitan Tribunal. And that's a lot of uniquely Catholic words going on right there.
It is.
Father Luke, welcome. Thank you for being here. Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, first of all, Sean, thanks for having me here. I am actually a native of Mobile, Alabama. I grew up there in a Catholic family and then moved from Alabama to Louisiana, where I got a degree in mechanical engineering. After getting the degree in mechanical engineering, I made my way here to Texas, where I worked for BP at the Texas City Refinery for many years. After working there for several years, I had been discerning seminary for quite a long time and eventually decided to go to seminary and see what would happen. So I went to seminary. I spent a few years in Dallas doing my studies in philosophy. After that, I was sent to Rome, where I did my studies in theology for 3 years. And then I did a 3-year degree in what we call canon law, which is the law that governs the church across the world. And so after finishing that degree, I came back to Houston to be a priest here at Houston and was immediately put into the tribunal, where I've served in various different capacities since then. As you mentioned, now I serve as what's called Judicial Vicar, which means I oversee all of the canonical matters for the diocese on behalf of Cardinal DiNardo.
Now, first of all, you're what we commonly refer to as a second career priest.
Correct, yes.
So you had a whole career and a whole secular life in industry. You went to college, you had a good job, and yet God still had other plans for you.
Other plans, despite my own ambitions elsewhere at times.
I love hearing those stories. And yet when you came in, you weren't just, it wasn't just a call to the priesthood, but getting that follow-up degree in canon law to actually become a canon lawyer, that's a whole other level of study and commitment to the church.
It is. And that's where the virtue of obedience comes in. When I went to seminary, there was, no kind of thought or indication in my mind that I would be doing anything more than just the normal theology degree. And then I was sent to Rome, and at some point I was informed I would be doing extra degrees. And the cardinal gave me some time to discern, and then he let me know the needs of the Archdiocese and invited me to study canon law on his behalf.
That's wonderful. So, in fact, you are an engineer and a lawyer.
I am.
And a priest.
And a priest.
Wow.
And I always joke that if I could just get a medical degree, then I would just have all my bases covered. But I did spend many, many years in the wilderness as a trail guide, and I was a trail medic for a period of time. So I figure that kind of counts.
Yeah, all this preparation for the priesthood, trail guide, engineer, and just this amazing ability to somehow find a way to integrate these pieces that, God's kind of prepared you for this new role.
For me, it was a necessary path. I would not have been, we'll just say, mature enough to enter into seminary before I did. I definitely needed that time to grow up, to experience life. And all of that really prepared me for the various roles that I've been doing since then. Other guys or other people have different paths, but for mine, that was definitely part of God's plan.
I laugh a little bit because my wife and I, we were friends for 6 years before we ever went on a date. In fact, we would actually call each other after we went on dates with other people.
Oh, that's funny.
To talk to each other. She was kind of the confidant for me after a couple dates. And yet, even as people would tell us, you guys would be so good together. Have you talked to her? I think you guys would be a great match. it was always, well, no, you don't date your friends. No, that's odd. That's awkward. And yet on our first date, it was kind of, oh, this is what everyone else was seeing. Oh, I get it now.
Right.
But we'll talk, and we readily admit we weren't ready to enter into that level of relationship and that discernment for marriage. God was preparing us for each other. And even though we were right there, it wasn't right until God made it readily apparent that this is where your call is. This is where your vocation is. And I think that's a great segue, because one of the things we wanted to talk about today is an issue that I think a lot of people think they know a lot about, or they know absolutely nothing about. The concept of annulments. And coming out of an understanding of what marriage is, knowing how high the divorce rate is in our society today, and then you hear the word annulment, and I think there's a lot of myths and misunderstandings that a lot of Catholics in the pews have about what that is and what that process is about. So I guess my first question to you is, what exactly is an annulment? Because I think the myth is, annulment is basically a Catholic divorce. Right,
yeah. So the first I would say is that we all commonly know the term annulment. The actual technical canonical term would be a declaration of nullity. And a lot of canonists kind of put a lot of emphasis on that difference, because an annulment says that something didn't exist to begin with. A declaration of nullity is something else. What we are doing is we're looking at something that existed, and we're saying that something was lacking there, that didn't achieve something that the church saw as necessary for a marriage to exist. And within that, we begin to see the difference between civil divorce and what some people will jokingly or mistakenly understand as Catholic divorce. I do understand why they see that, but there is also a difference. In civil divorce, what we have is the civil state itself saying that two people who were bound together in a marriage that existed have now separated and now are free to remarry in the state again. So in a certain sense, that's why I can see people saying that, well, it's nothing but Catholic divorce, because it is also the church saying that two people who are bound together in marriage are separated, and yet they are free to marry in the church again. And yet, at the same time, there is a difference, because with civil divorce, they don't say that there was not a marriage that existed. There was a marriage that existed, and that marriage no longer exists. But the children of that marriage are legitimate children. The effects of that marriage did exist. There are similarities to the annulment process within this, and there are some differences. The similarity is that we also recognize that a marriage existed. There was a relationship. In the law, we would call it a putative marriage. The children of that marriage are legitimate children. But the difference is, the state does not look back and say, when you got married and you said your vows and you did all this, you didn't actually intend to get married. They say it was a marriage, it's now no longer a marriage, you are now free to marry. Well, for Catholics, our understanding of marriage is such that when we'll look at first the concept of a sacramental marriage first, and I'll break that down later. But with a sacramental marriage where two baptized people marry together, they exchange their vows with one another, and they consummate that marriage with the marital act. In that situation, we say that no one, no power on earth has the ability to sever that marriage, because that marriage exists. It is a reality which is blessed and intended by God, and it cannot be separated at all.
And I think that's one of the questions people have is, how can the church say that these two people are no longer married when, as you just said, and we read it in Scripture, these two people are bound?
Correct.
Man cannot separate them.
Correct.
So what is the church doing in that moment?
Correct. And that's where we get into the differences between what a civil divorce looks at and what the church looks at. So the Catholic understanding of marriage, and now I'll step back a little bit because I talked about a sacramental marriage, but we need to open up the question a little bit more. Every human being has a natural right to marriage. But that natural right is bounded by what we see as divine law, that which is given to us by God, and that which defines what marriage is. And for the Catholic Church and through Scripture, we understand marriage to be a union between a man and a woman who are able to give themselves freely to each other. That ability to give themselves to each other freely might be blocked by certain things. Let's say, for example, someone doesn't have the intellectual capacity to understand what marriage is. Someone who lacks that intellectual capacity is not able to give themselves to marriage. Or let's say someone lacks the physical capacity to give themselves to marriage, or the psychological capacity. In those situations, marriage itself will be blocked. Or let's say there are what we call impediments in the church that keep a marriage from forming. So everyone knows that a brother and a sister cannot marry. That's just commonly understood. There are debates, for example, about whether cousins should be allowed to marry. But there are many different things that we look at that we say, well, marriage is not allowed to occur between these two types of people. Brothers and sisters cannot marry. Cousins may or may not be able to marry. These are realities that are also recognized by civil law and by church law. In the church, we have a list of things that we call impediments that would keep a marriage from forming naturally between two people. And so in the annulment process, or the declaration of nullity process, what we were looking at is we were looking at a marriage that exists, and we were looking, first of all, at was there something that kept that marriage from forming? Was there perhaps an impediment? For example, were they brother or sister? Were they some type of relationship that would not be allowed to marry by God's law, by divine law, by human law, whatever it might be? Then we also look at, did they have the capacity to give themselves in marriage? Was there something on the intellectual, the psychological, or even the physical level that keeps them from marrying or from being able to enter into a valid union with each other? So let's look at the physical level, because this would be something that would touch on impediments as well. The Catholic Church understands that marriage has a couple ends, a couple goods, one of which is the openness to children, another which is permanence, another which is faithfulness and sexual fidelity. And so these are three things that we understand that marriage has to possess. A fourth one would be the desire for the good of the spouse, the desire of the good for the other. Now, let's say, for example, that someone is physically unable to consummate, to have the sexual act. In church law, that means that person is not able to enter into marriage, since children, openness to children, is an aspect of marriage itself. Now, this is different than impotence. If someone's able to have the sexual act but not able to have children, they're still free to marry in the Catholic Church.
Now, would this apply, say, to older individuals, women who are past a certain age and are no longer able to have children? Are they still able to enter into a sacramental marriage?
Correct. That's a very good question. So the answer is yes. Those who are past childbearing age are still able to enter into marriage as long as they're still able to exchange the sexual act. This canon law opens up a whole can of worms, and one of the cans you just opened is what about, let's say, for example, we have an older couple who got civilly married, and they were never married in the church. They go through the declaration of nullity process, so they're now free to marry in the church. But they are at an age now where they're not able to express that physical intimacy. The question is, what can we do in that situation? Well, because they are already civilly married, we can do what's called a radical sanation, a retroactive validation of the marriage that occurred when they exchanged their civil vows. And that allows us to bring the marriage back and cure it, as it says in the roots, at the moment when they exchanged consent, at a time when they were still able to exchange sexual intimacy.
This gets real complicated real fast.
It does.
I understand. There's that old joke, if the law was easy, we wouldn't need lawyers.
Exactly.
And I'm understanding more and more that I get into canon law, I see the need for that, because while we have these very defined rules on what the church can do, should do, is supposed to do in situations, the laws that govern not only the church's actions, but our actions, we find these moments where the reality of these specific situations, the specificity of a pastoral need needs to be applied.
Correct. Yes. And we live in a time period where no one wants a lawyer, right? You never want a lawyer unless you actually need a lawyer. And because of that, we live in a time period where the law isn't really liked or respected, which I understand. I feel that way sometimes about other laws as well. And yet, one difference about canon law is meant to be pastoral in nature. At the heart of canon law, it is meant to help people, to meet people where they are, and to assist them forward in their journey towards God. And so, at its heart, we always want this declaration of nullity process or any canonical process to be eminently pastoral. And so there are many things that we will do and talk about where there are often pastoral remedies baked into the law itself that allows us to deal with these difficult situations that occur within people's lives.
I want to ask a question because the Office of Communications receives a lot of if you send an initial email to the diocese, we have a general email address, which is info@archgh.org, if anyone wants to send us an email or ask a question. If you send us something there, or if you use the Contact Us page on our website, it flows into our office and we distribute it to the appropriate ministry or individuals who can respond to that. But one of the questions we often get asked is, I've been married for 15, 20, 25 years. Does the length of the marriage affect the ability to obtain an annulment?
Yes, that definitely is. I will say yes and no. It depends, as any good canonist will tell you. If you want to pass any test in canon law, the answer is usually, if the question is why, salvation of souls. If the question is can you, the answer is it depends. So let's go back. I mentioned briefly the start of the annulment process. I need to kind of finish that so we can answer your question. So as I mentioned, the annulment process is looking at, was there anything that blocked a marriage from forming? So was there potentially an impediment? Was there an inability to give consent for some reason due to a psychological, a physical, or a mental issue? And then the last thing that we're looking for is when the person exchanged consent, were they deliberately withholding something? Were they deliberately withholding their will? Were they deliberately withholding something that we as Catholics believe must be present for a marriage to exist between a man and a woman? So let's say, for example, we talked about children, and we talked about permanence, we talked about sexual fidelity and the good of the spouse. Let's say that someone goes into the marriage, and when they're exchanging their vows, and they're saying, I do, and they're giving their love to the other person, behind their back, their fingers are crossed, and they're saying, the second that my spouse does XYZ, I am gone. Or I'm saying yes, but I reserve the right to have sex with whoever I want, whenever I want, regardless of these vows I'm making today. In that situation, they are deliberately withholding fidelity, or they're deliberately withholding openness to children, or whatever it might be. That says that at that moment, they did not truly give themselves to marriage. They gave themselves to something else. And the annulment process, if we're looking at what we call a formal declaration of nullity, in that we are looking at what occurred prior to the consent, during the moment of consent, and after. Because what we have to know is what was going on in the person's mind and heart at the time they exchanged consent, which is difficult to figure out. Most people just aren't able to just walk up and say, well, this is what was in my mind and heart, and I can prove it in this way. We can prove it, though, by looking at what occurred before and what occurred after, and speaking to the parties and speaking to witnesses. So let's take the example of sexual fidelity. Let's say that we are able to prove and know that during the dating period, someone was unfaithful. And immediately after they married, the person was unfaithful. That tends to tell us that at the moment of consent, in their heart and mind, they believed that it was okay to be unfaithful. So then we look at what the law tells us, we look at the way the law is interpreted, and we're able to make a determination. Was it a valid marriage or not? Did the person withhold their consent or not? And at that moment, we might be able to give a declaration of nullity and declare with all moral certitude that at the moment that consent was exchanged, that the person did not fully give themselves to marriage as understood by the Catholic Church. Therefore, no marriage validly occurred, and since no marriage validly occurred, they are now free to marry in the Catholic Church. As far as the length of the marriage, that is something that serves as a fact as we're looking at this. How long did the marriage last? Okay, the marriage lasted for 25 years. Why did it last for 25 years? Was it because there were no problems until 25 years later, in which case it might indicate that at the moment of consent, these issues were not present? Was it that it lasted 25 years for the children, but that entire period of time there were issues with sexual fidelity or abuse or addiction? That might show us that at the moment of consent, there was an issue present, but the marriage lasted for 25 years because of their belief in the sanctity of marriage, because of the children, because of a long list of possible reasons. And so the length of the marriage is important, but it's important as a fact, and that fact itself must be discerned within the situation and within the particular aspect of the law that we are looking at.
You mentioned testimony and witnesses. Knowing people who've gone through that process of seeking a declaration of nullity, can you give me a little bit of background on how does the church do that? I mean, this sounds very judicial already, which coincides with your title, but how does the church go about investigating something like this when somebody says, well, I don't believe, vows, that the consent was given.
Correct.
I don't believe a sacramental marriage took place. How do you verify? How does the tribunal go about verifying claims like that?
Right. Well, the first thing I will say is that it is, as you mentioned, it is a judicial process, which means that we have actual procedural laws that govern what we must do. And that means it is at times a long process or a complicated process. And someone might say, well, why are you having to do this? Well, we're having to do it because the law itself tells us we must do this. But so the process itself, I'll outline the process, then I'll talk about, well, how long does it actually take in reality? But so the process starts with someone making a petition. So in the Archdiocese of Galveston-Houston, we have numerous lay volunteers as well as priests and deacons who have been trained to be what we call case sponsors. Our case sponsors are not canonists. They are not trained canon lawyers. Rather, they are lay volunteers or clerics who serve as ministers to those who have experienced difficulties in their marriage and want to petition the tribunal to determine whether that marriage was valid or not valid, so that they know whether they can or cannot be married again in the Catholic Church.
So less a lawyer and more like an advocate to help guide them through the process.
Correct, exactly. Now, I don't use the term advocate for them, because in canon law, advocate is a very specific canonical term of someone who has rights in the process. That's why we use the term case sponsor rather than advocate. But yes, they are an advocate on the behalf of the person making the petition. So this case sponsor will meet with the petitioner. They will listen to their story. And that's, for me, the most important part of this. For someone to hear their story, to hear their pain, to hear what happened in their lives, what brought them to where they are today. And as the case sponsor is listening, they should also be listening to hear, well, what is going on here? Because we're talking about declaration of nullity right now, but there are also some other marriage processes out there that maybe we'll talk about in the future, such as a Pauline privilege or a favor of the faith, a prior bond, some other various things, or a lack of form. But so the case sponsor will be listening and hearing what happened and what is the process that needs to be pursued if we want to determine if they're free to marry in the Catholic Church. And so let's say after listening, they determine that it is something that needs to go through the declaration of nullity process. At that point, the case sponsor will help them to begin filling out the paperwork, which is very long, and ask a lot of questions. The reason I ask a lot of questions is, again, because we need to start to get a sense of what occurred in the person's family of origin, Let's say, for example, the person grew up with abuse and they began dating someone who abused them. Well, those two things are generally directly linked, and that lets us know there might be something going on that affected their mind, their heart, their intellect, that made them unable to truly understand and choose marriage in a free way. But so we look at what was their family of origin like. We look at what was their dating history like, what was the dating of this particular person who they divorced. We look at the marriage. We look at the time after the marriage and what led to the divorce. So when they complete this paperwork, they also complete a summary of that, which is called the libellus, which means little book. And that libellus is important because it serves as the actual canonical petition for a declaration of nullity. So we receive that into the tribunal. We then look at it. We make sure that all the information we need is present. If not, we ask them to give us more information. Some of the information that is included in that is the request for witnesses, because the law requires that we use witnesses in the process. It is very hard to prove any of this in a case without at least one qualified witness or several witnesses who can affirm that, yes, we know that this occurred. We know that this person suffered abuse. We know that this person was unfaithful. We know that whatever it might be occurred.
Now, this is something that we hear from people who have begun that process, is because the tribunal is asking for so much information and asking for witnesses that it almost feels intrusive a little bit. It's bringing up, bad memories, or it's bringing up animosity, or, why do I have to get these people to talk about my relationship and my supposed marriage? Why do you need all this information?
Yes, and I agree. It is a very hard, a very difficult process, and it can be very painful. What I've seen, though, for those who truly enter into the process with an open heart, and they truly enter into it as a ministerial process, is that it also begins to become a process of healing. Because many of us, when we've had failed relationships, and I myself before seminary dated, and I know about relationships and how they can be painful. And often when we move through a failed relationship, after the failed relationship, there are many times when we don't actually pause to reflect on what went wrong in that relationship. Why did that marriage fall apart? What did I contribute to it? What did they contribute to it? More often than not, we tend to think, well, they were the ones at fault. Well, relationships are a two-way street. And in pausing to reflect on this, to me, it's like ripping the Band-Aid off a wound. It opens the wound up, but in opening the wound up, it allows the wound to begin to heal. Because my hope is always that anyone who goes through this process has the ability to reflect on what occurred, and through that reflection to recognize any patterns of behavior that need to be fixed, so that then they can be healed and enter into a new relationship in a way that doesn't carry all of this previous baggage forward. Let's say, for example, again, someone who grew up in a family where abuse was common. And then, because that is what they know, they date people who abuse them. They don't know, why is this constantly happening? My hope would be that in this process, they recognize, oh, I have this baggage. I need to stop choosing these type of people who will hurt me, so that moving forward, they are able to make better and healthier decisions about the relationships they pursue in the future.
Now, before they begin this process, it's my understanding that they have to receive a civil divorce before they can begin the process to receive a declaration of nullity. Is that correct?
Correct. In the United States, we require a civil divorce to be obtained before we will pursue the process, because the civil divorce lets us know that there's no way of reconciling these two people back together. Because again, our first intent as a church is not to rip apart families or marriages, it is to restore them. And the civil divorce lets us know that, first of all, there's no way of reconciling this marriage together. The second reason it's important in the United States is because priests in the United States serve as both civil ministers and religious ministers when they administer a wedding. So let's say, for example, that a couple did not get a civil divorce. They went through the declaration of nullity process and received a declaration of nullity, and were now free to marry in the church again. They then approach a priest who says they're free to marry in the church. I will now marry them. But they were never civilly divorced. So now the Catholic priest, who also in this instance serves as a civil minister, has committed the crime of assisting in bigamy, because this person now is civilly married to two separate people. And so this enters into legal issues as well. So there are various different reasons why we need a civil divorce, but it touches both on the inability for that marriage to be reconciled, as well as their freedom to marry before the civil state in the future.
Now, this brings up, to go back to the investigation, this brings up another issue. We've heard from multiple people, and I have friends who have gone through the process where they were told, we need to talk to your former spouse.
Correct.
And again, it brought up a lot of anger, a lot of hurt feelings, or the former spouse, did not want to participate in the process.
Correct.
How does that work? Why does the tribunal need to talk to the former spouse if you already know you have, one side of the case? Is that required? If they don't want to participate, how does the tribunal work with that?
Right. And that's actually a perfect segue into the next step of the process, because after we receive the petition with all the information from the petitioner, including witnesses, life story, all of that information, when we receive it in the tribunal, the next thing we have to do by law is contact the respondent. Because in the law, everyone has a right. When I say everyone, I mean the petitioner and the respondent both have a right to speak in the process. Because let's say, I'm not going to say any petitioner ever lies. What I will say is that everyone has their own perception of what occurred. All of us can see the same event and describe it in completely different terms. And so we also need to get the side of the respondent to hear what they have to say. They also then would present their own life story, their own family of origin issues, their own dating history, their own experience of dating this person, the petitioner, their own experience of the vows and of the life after the exchange of consent. And the respondent, the one who the petitioner divorced, the respondent would also then present witnesses for their side of the story as well. Now, if the respondent chooses to not participate, we can still move forward in the process. But actually, it's much better for us when the respondent participates, because that helps to validate and helps us to see whether what the petitioner said is presenting a coherent picture of that relationship or not. And sometimes you might even have petitioners saying one thing, the respondent saying something completely different, and yet we are able to see that, yes, they are both presenting the same reality from two different sides. Or we might have a situation where it's clear that one side is not speaking the truth. Well, that allows us also to discern all of this information going forward.
There is so much involved with this process. You mentioned before, you'd mentioned how long this all would take. Realistically, in an average case, and I know obviously you can't reveal specifics, but how long does an average case take from getting a case sponsor, like you said, at the parish level, to receiving a judgment from the tribunal?
So the case sponsor part of how long it might last in last outside the tribunal, that is completely dependent really on the petitioner themselves. There are some people who will enter into the process, they'll finish their paperwork very quickly, within a month or a few months. There are others, because it's painful, as we discussed, it might take them a year or 2 years or even longer to fill everything out and submit it. Once it comes to the tribunal, the time it takes to get to the end of the process and have a decision granted is variable depending on a couple factors. It depends on, first of all, how quickly does everyone respond? Because as we talked about, there are certain people in the process who have rights to be reached out to, the respondent, the witnesses. And so if we reach out to them, they don't respond, they have a certain amount of time by which they can respond. And so we have to wait. So let's say a case comes in and everything is heard very smoothly. Everyone responds very quickly. We've had some cases that have been done within 6 to 9 months as far as our complete time from the time it comes to the tribunal to the time it leaves. The average, however, tends to be somewhere probably around 11 to 12 months. Because if things get dragged out, if translations are required, if witnesses are located outside the United States, that will drag that time out. But I think in general right now, for most people, it's taking about a year. Some will get it quicker, some will get it a little longer, but I would say the average is probably around 11 to 12 months right now.
One of the other questions we get is something that people have heard, is that annulments are expensive, that it costs a lot of money, and it's a feeling like, well, I'm paying the church to give me something that they're saying never existed in the first place.
Right. Yes, and that is manifests itself in many ways. So one is that people see as a commercial exchange. We give you money, therefore you give us the ability to marry in the church. And there are many other kind of misconceptions that come with that. But the reality is we don't want money to be a part of the process. So back around 2017, Pope Francis revamped the marriage process for the declaration of nullity process for the Roman Catholic Church. With these new rules, we took the opportunity to eliminate this issue of finances. So all the processes in the tribunal are completely free except for the petition for a formal declaration of nullity. And for that, we ask for $100. And we can dispense it in financial need. The reason we ask for any money is because we want people, if you will, to put some skin in the game. We want them to realize this is something that they are committing to. Because otherwise, what we found is people could enter into the process and say, well, it doesn't really matter. I'm just gonna stop responding. I'm not going to pay attention. And so while we can dispense the $100 for those who have financial need, we find that it helps people to actually remain more committed to the process. Now, I'll be the first to tell you, $100 does not even begin to cover the cost of the process. We have currently at the tribunal 14. We just received a new person. We have 14 full-time employees at the tribunal. If you think of salaries, you think of how much salaries cost for an average person across the course of a year, we could charge as much as we want for annulments, and that would never begin to cover the cost of the actual process itself. So we cover the process by the DSF campaign, the Diocesan Service Fund. We are fully funded by the DSF. And so all of the money, I shouldn't say all of the money, a portion of the money given by the people of God in the Archdiocese of Galveston-Houston for the DSF campaign goes to pay for the salary of our employees, for the supplies for the process, for all those things. And so for us, it's not a money-making venture. We would never be able to charge enough to offset the cost of the ministry we do.
And to be clear, the tribunal handles a lot more than just annulments.
Correct, yes. So as I like to jokingly tell people, marriage law is about 10% of the Code of Canon Law and about 90% of the work. The other 90% of the law sometimes takes up about 10% of the work of the tribunal. But those are things such as issues at parishes, questions with sacraments, problems with priests or with deacons. And so anything that touches the life of the church has something that corresponds to it in the Code of Canon Law. And so we deal with all sorts of other requests, groups that want to be recognized as an official association of the Catholic Church, questions about religious. There's a whole umbrella. There's a whole there's a completely different world out there that most people don't recognize and know, because for the most part, most people do not interact with that aspect of the law unless they're having problems or unless they want to interact with the church and become an official representative of the church or something along those lines.
A friend of mine once referenced this. A friend of mine who was a deacon, who was also a medical professional, likened it to the understanding that if you go in with an upset stomach, you expect the doctor to know everything about upset stomachs, not recognizing that he has a complete understanding of the skeletal system as well.
Correct. Yes, that's actually a very good way to look at it. But yes, so canon law is a very broad body of law. And where it impacts the people of God most especially is the sacraments. So obviously we see that here in the sacrament of marriage, but we also deal with a lot of questions about baptism, about confirmation, and issues that come up there. We deal with a lot of issues that deal with the sacraments when someone's in danger of death. And a priest might call and say, I have a parishioner who's dying, and I don't know how to handle giving this particular sacrament or whether I'm able to give this particular sacrament. And so definitely as far as the people of God, I would say the sacramental issues are the things that probably affect them most profoundly that we deal with at the tribunal.
You mentioned before about sacramental marriage. So does seeking an annulment only apply to Catholics? Say someone was married outside of the church to a non-Catholic, maybe even to a non-Christian. Let's say two people were married previously and divorced, and then one of them went through RCIA and now wants to marry again. Does the annulment process have to be applied to every marriage?
Right. That touches on something that I mentioned briefly at the very beginning. So everyone has a right to marriage. And so whenever two unbaptized people marry, or a baptized person marries an unbaptized person, we would call that a natural marriage. So it is a true marriage. It is a real marriage. It counts, if you will. We wouldn't say, well, it wasn't a Catholic marriage. It was two unbaptized people. It was a Muslim and a Buddhist, or it was, two Protestants. It's not a Catholic marriage. It doesn't count. No, every marriage counts. And so if it's between an unbaptized person and a baptized, or two unbaptized people, it's what we call a natural law marriage. It is a real marriage that exists that needs to be looked at. Because if, let's say, we have this person who was married outside the Catholic Church, a Buddhist who married another Buddhist, and the Buddhist wants to become Catholic, but they've divorced that person and married someone else. Well, in the understanding of the Church, we have an issue because we have someone who is validly married to another Buddhist who divorced and is now married to someone else, which is contrary to God's law about marriage. And so we would then have to look at that marriage and determine whether that person was able to have their current marriage recognized by the Catholic Church. And that might require that Buddhist to go through a declaration of nullity process, or perhaps through a process that we call a Pauline privilege, whereby when that person becomes baptized, they are allowed to marry in the Catholic Church in virtue of their baptism. I don't want to get too far afield with the concept of Pauline privilege today, but the simple fact is that for us, every marriage counts unless we determine it was not a valid marriage, or unless we determine it's a situation in which the law of the Church allows us to dissolve a non-sacramental natural bond marriage in favor of a sacramental union. So the difference between sacramental and natural would be that any marriage between two baptized people is a sacramental marriage. It is something instituted by God himself, which reveals to the world the love that God has for his church. And that is between any two baptized people, period. That's not just two baptized Catholics. So two Baptists who are baptized and marry each other, that is a sacramental marriage. A Catholic married to a baptized Protestant is a sacramental marriage. Let's say that a Catholic marries someone who's not baptized. That is a valid Catholic non-sacramental union because they are not married to a baptized person. But as soon as that person becomes baptized, now that Catholic is in a sacramental union. And so it gets, as we talked about before, marriage law can get very complicated. But job security for me.
The last one I want to bring up is something that we hear often, and not as much necessarily anymore, but we hear about, well, this happened to my aunt or this happened to my cousin. A lot of secondhand is the idea that when someone gets a civil divorce, we hear stories of people being told, you can no longer receive the sacraments, or you're now in a state of sin, or we even heard one time someone emailed us, I know I'm excommunicated from the church because I got a divorce. And I know that's not the teaching, but can you explain to us, when someone gets a civil divorce, what is their standing in the church?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a little bit of a soapbox issue for me, because there are so many misconceptions around this. Like you said, many people think that when they are divorced as Catholics, that they are excommunicated. Excommunication is a really big deal in the Catholic Church. That means you are no longer in communion. You are no longer a part of the Catholic Church. And I don't know where this concept came from, because it's not in the law. So let's say two Catholics are married, they get divorced. As long as they are not doing anything else contrary to God's law, they're still able to fully participate in the sacraments, to go to Mass, to receive Eucharist, to receive confession. It only becomes an issue when someone who was married that divorces begins to do something contrary to God's law. Let's say they begin to have sex outside of the marriage, which still exists in God's eyes. Even though there is a civil divorce, that marriage still exists. So if they begin having sex with someone else, not only is it sex outside of marriage, which would be sinful, it is also, at that point, in the church's eyes, infidelity. Therefore, they can't receive the sacraments because they're in sin unless they go to confession and have that sin absolved.
And I would assume refrain from continuing
Correct.
In that relationship.
Correct. And refrain from continuing that relationship. So let's say that someone has been in a valid Catholic marriage, they've civilly divorced, and they have remarried outside the Catholic Church. Well, now the problem is that they are continuing in a state of sin as long as they are exercising that sexual union with their current civil partner. So what John Paul II told us in his document Familiaris Consortio is that in that situation, as long as they are willing to stop the sexual activity, or I should say make an earnest attempt to stop the sexual activity, that they can be allowed to return to confession and through that to return to the Eucharist.
I think we've often heard that as living as brother and sister.
Correct, exactly. So there are pastoral remedies for this. But the biggest part I want to emphasize is, first of all, let's say that they don't do this. Let's say they are still continuing to live in a state that the church sees objectively as sinful. They are still Catholic. They are not excommunicated from the church. They still belong to us. They still have a place with us. We still want them. And I will further emphasize that an issue that comes up often with American Catholics, we have a great devotion to the Eucharist, which I love. I greatly love. But the dark side of that is some people say, well, if I can't receive Eucharist, I shouldn't go to Mass. But our obligation is to go to Mass every Sunday. Our obligation is only to receive the Eucharist once a year. And so let's say that you are a Catholic who finds yourself in an irregular marriage situation, or you are divorced, or whatever it is, and you feel you can't receive the Eucharist. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be going to Mass. You should still be going to Mass, and you will receive graces from being there. And hopefully God's grace will then be able to lift you out of whatever situation you are in and eventually bring you back into, I want to say full communion, but that indicates you were excommunicated, which you weren't. So bring you back into a position and a state in life where you're able to fully participate in all of the sacraments again.
I think that brings up the other half of that conversation, which is, can a Catholic get a civil divorce for a good reason? Or is that already contrary to God's law? I mean, if I get a divorce, isn't that on one level one of the partners saying, I'm done, I'm out?
Right. No, that's a really good question. Because as Catholics, as we talked about, we believe that permanence is an aspect of marriage, which is opposed by divorce. So when you get married, we want you to believe and intend permanence and to be together the rest of your lives. And yet our law itself recognizes that there are situations which either allow, or I'll even say require and necessitate, that the spouses separate. And so in our law, we have a section of law that talks about when can spouses separate. The marital bond still remains. They are still married. But when can they actually separate and not live together? And it talks about situations which are, if you will, harmful or intolerable for one party or both parties in the marriage. Let's say that someone is suffering abuse from their spouse. The church does not say you must stay in that marriage and be abused. The law says, no, in this situation, you must separate from your spouse. And so we have a whole section of the law that talks about the Catholic actually has a right to separate from their spouse in certain circumstances. And in those circumstances would be when we would say the Catholic also has a right to seek a civil divorce. Now, in some places, people will come to the tribunal to ask for permission for a civil divorce. In the United States, that is not a process we do. We leave that to the discernment of the Catholic party themselves about whether the conditions warrant, whether they can or cannot separate. And of course, that should always be done through discernment with the assistance of their pastor.
And just to be clear, just because a civil divorce is granted, that may not be grounds for a declaration of nullity.
Correct. Yes. So it may not be grounds for a declaration of nullity, although it might be. And we would only know that if they enter into the process. And you don't have to seek a declaration of nullity. That is a choice the person can make. But what we would say is if you want to seek another marriage in the Catholic Church, we would have to look at the situation and then make a determination about whether they are or are not free to marry in the Catholic Church.
Father, if someone had further questions about seeking a declaration of nullity, about knowing their particular stance in a relationship, or if they wanted to know, how do I get this process started? You said at the parish level. What's the next step for them?
I would recommend that if they have questions, there are a couple different steps they could take. One is simply to approach a priest or a deacon at their parish and speak with them, ask them, and seek counsel with them. And the priest or deacon can answer many of these questions themselves. If they don't, that's when they would call us at the tribunal. I also mentioned case sponsors, who are always a resource at the parish. Let's say as a parish is very small, there's only one priest, and he can't handle all these questions himself. He will hopefully have some of our lay case sponsors who could assist him in this process. And of course, you can always reach out to the tribunal itself directly. You can email us at tribunal@archdh.org, or you could call the tribunal directly, just by calling the chancery and asking to speak with a tribunal official.
And we'll go ahead and put all those links and everything in the show notes for this episode.
Okay, perfect.
Father Luke, thank you for sharing all this information with us. It is a lot.
It is.
As you said, canon law is very broad and covers a lot of things. And as you mentioned, this is only covering 10% of canon law.
And we covered maybe 1% of that 10%. And your heads are probably already spinning. So hopefully I didn't confuse everyone too much.
And as always, if you would like to learn more about the ministries and offices of the Archdiocese, you can find us online at archgh.org. That's archgh.org. Thank you for joining us. We'll talk to you next time here on Around the Archdiocese.